Hello, everybody. Welcome. Thank you so much for joining us tonight for this online case study session about the New Haven Energy Recovery Facility. My name's Skye McParland. I work for Veolia, and for those of you who don't know me or maybe haven't met me out and amongst the community, I look after the engagement activities that we've been doing with people living locally and nearby our site. Before we get started today, I would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the lands in which we're all gathered on today and pay my respects to their elders past and present. So as you all know, we are in the public exhibition phase for the Advanced Energy Recovery Centre Environmental Impact Statement. And we have been hosting a whole series of events for the weeks just gone, and we do have some more coming up as well. So what this means in this period of time is that this is our formal presentation of results to the community, and then this is the time for the community to have their say to the Department of Planning and Environment. So if you haven't already done that, please make sure that you do throughout this period, and you must do that by the 6th of December. So before the EIS launch, we spoke to the community, and we also engaged some feedback from them about the ways in which they want to receive information from us and how they wanted to hear about the results of the EIS. Overwhelmingly, people had said to us that they want to have the face-to-face sessions, they want to be able to speak to our experts, they want to be able to speak to our project team. And that's really why we've been doing a lot of in-person sessions and having the drop-in capability at our site, plus having the pop-ups right around the region. We will be doing a few more of those, and we know that people really, really do want to do those as a priority. But we did have quite a few people ask us about our international capability, and they wanted to hear a bit more about our reference sites, not just for what we've included for the EIS, which of course is the Staffordshire site, but the capability that we've had beyond that, and our expertise in that area. So we thought it would be an ideal time for us to have an online session, even though people do prefer to meet in person, to be able to bring to you an independent expert from the UK that actually worked on our New Haven facility as part of the air quality assessment, and we have him available tonight to be talking us through that case study. So I have Dr. Roger Brown, who is an air quality and emissions specialist, joining us today, and he's going to take us through the New Haven case study. As I mentioned, we'll talk to him. He and I will have a bit of a conversation quite candidly about his role with the facility and what some of the results of the operating facility are now that that's actually live. Richard, sorry, your name is not Richard, it's Roger. I'm thinking about CEO. Roger has 35 years experience in the sector, and for this particular site, he undertook the planning part of the facility before it was actually operating, and then the monitoring side once it was in operation as well. So a really detailed understanding of how an operating facility comes to be in real life. So we'll be able to deep dive into that. So Roger, apologies for getting your name wrong there, but thank you so much for joining us and welcome. I know in the UK it's early in the morning, so I won't say good evening to you, but good morning, and thanks so much for joining us.
Hello there. Hi. Well, it's 8 o'clock here in the UK, and just about breakfast time. So it's an early start. So I started life, I guess, as an organic chemist. I've got a degree and a PhD from Southampton University. And then I moved on. It was a fairly natural progression to be involved in analytical work. I worked for some of the largest mass spectrometry companies. These are instruments that are used for looking for really low levels of pollutants and other things as well. They often used for medical purposes too. And then at some point I got involved in the waste management industry and been looking at both the emissions from chimney stacks, which is what an emissions person does, and also looking at air quality, which is more to do with the air that we breathe, and the way it affects us and the health effects of that. So my expertise often is involved in monitoring and developing plans for how you go about getting useful data, much of which is to do with the background of what the air quality is like today.
Well, thanks for that overview. And I will also just say, for those people who are joining us online, we do have Scott Fishwick, who is the independent expert working on the Advanced Energy Recovery Centre air quality assessment, or did do that work. And he's here for us to touch base with him throughout the session if there's elements that he might be able to add in terms of how that's relevant to our specific site that we're proposing. So I will just say, just to set some transparency around this, Roger hasn't actually worked on the proposal for the ARC. He's only really here to talk about the New Haven facility today. So just wanted to be really clear about the fact that he hasn't actually worked on the ARC proposal. So Roger, let's jump straight in. Can you tell us a bit about how energy recovery is used in the UK, and I suppose a bit about its role overall in terms of supporting a holistic waste management approach?
Okay. We've had energy from waste plants now from, well, probably from about 1990, when we had a change in legislation that came in looking at integrated pollution control in the UK. That heralded in a whole new generation of facilities. The older facilities came to an end at that point, and the new generation came online. And initially, as over that period of time, there's been a fantastic increase in the public and communities looking at recycling. So I think it's fair to say that pre-1990, the only thing that used to get recycled pretty much used to be glass bottles, perhaps tin cans now and again. But from that point onwards, we've had a mixture of recycling programs until we've got to today, where we're actually a fairly sophisticated recycling community. Various parts of the United Kingdom vary in their engagement in that, but certainly here in Wales, they talk about something like 60% of waste is recycled. And that varies from having lots of different bins that we put out where we separate the waste. Sometimes it all goes in together and then it goes to a waste transfer station where it's done by the waste management company. It doesn't really matter, but whatever is recyclable is recycled first. So, you know, all the plastics that carry those little triangles that we get used to seeing, that gets off, they go off to be recycled. Likewise, tin cans, aluminium cans, they all go off for being dealt with and melted down and reused. Paper as well. Paper's a very good one for being recycled. But we do end up with some other wastes that aren't so good. Putrescible waste, so that's the sort of rotting food waste that we all end up having. And that often goes off for composting and digestion, perhaps. And then you end up with some wastes that are just not very amenable, or you can't determine what they came from, and so it's very difficult to recycle those. So that they tend to go as a stream. Some of that will go for waste incineration. Now, I say incineration, that's the front end of the process. That's not what we call the whole plant, because basically we're trying to get the energy value back from that waste and use that usefully to heat our homes, to power industry, whatever. But we don't want to throw that away because there's valuable energy in that stream. So
no, thanks for that. I think, you know, you raise certainly an important point, is that, you know, there is a waste hierarchy that still is maintained as part of the holistic approach to waste management, with the introduction of energy from waste, and those materials that can be extracted through reducing, reusing, recycling at the front end, priority still maintained to do that. And that's certainly the intention in Australia as well. So thanks for clarifying that. I'd be really interested to know a bit more about the New Haven site and what you did on for that site as part of the air quality assessment. But before we kind of get to that, I thought it might be useful for people to understand where exactly New Haven is, and what is surrounding the site in which the energy recovery facility is located.
Yep, that's useful. So New Haven's a smallish town. It's on the south coast of the United Kingdom. It's 10 or 15 miles east of Brighton, and there's another small-ish town called Lewes. It looks like Lewes when you look at the way it's spelled, Lewes, and that's a little bit to the north west of New Haven. And New Haven's also situated around about 50 to 60 miles south of London. Between London and New Haven, we've got the South Downs, which is an area of special scientific interest. It's often used by walkers, and it's a very pretty area. Not particularly high, but it's got a series of rolling hills, and it's really quite a beautiful area, and obviously ecologically quite important. So New Haven itself is a strange mix. It's a port. There's a ferry that runs a couple of times a day to Dieppe. It's tried to reinvent itself a few times because it's had a mixture of it's got an industrial element to it, but more recently it's also got a marina. You can see on the slide there to the left there's a marina area and some newer houses and developments there, and the circle shows you where the ERF is situated. This particular one, it's all sort of rounded and curved, and the idea is it fits in and mimics back the idea of the rolling hills of the South Downs. That was the original architect's idea when they were developing it, and generally the architecture of these facilities in the UK is quite interesting, although that's far beyond my expertise.
And it looks like there's, some rural capacity at the back of this.
Oh yeah, yeah.
Here, is that farmland?
That's a mixture of farmland. All of that runs up towards the South Downs, which is part of. So yeah, it's a mixture of light industrial, residential, and farming as well. So you've got a whole mix of things. They're quite busy roads though as well, that come down, because there's a roadway that goes right across the south coast, the A27, to the north of New Haven, and the road coming into New Haven is also quite busy because it brings traffic into the port.
Okay. Well, thanks for that. It's good to have that context, definitely. And in terms of the air quality study that was undertaken for this site, can you talk us through the methodology that was used to do that?
Sure. Basically, back in about 2001, the UK government produced a whole load of different air quality data, and they made a series of predictions. So whenever we do any air quality work, it's always useful looking to see what else is available. We don't want to reinvent wheels. So in this particular case, we took data, or we looked at data that predicted what the levels of nitrogen dioxide was, and they also did it for sulfur dioxide and fine particulates, PM10s. And there were a series of graphs produced by the government that showed that, hardly surprisingly, that the pollution in the area centered on New Haven and Lewes in that particular part. And they gave us predictions as well. They gave us high-level predictions of what the pollutants would look like in 2005 and 2010. Now, that's based upon what they thought would happen in the UK from 2001. So there's a lot of crystal ball gazing going on here, trying to predict how we all live and what's going to go on. So that can only ever be, you can't be totally accurate with that, but it's a good indication. And then, oh, sorry, carry on.
No, you go, keep going. I won't cut you off.
Then what you have to do next is to look at which way the wind blows. Now, in the UK, we have a predominant wind direction from the southwest. A lot of that brings in, well, it's influenced by Atlantic weather that we get, and from weather from Spain, etc. So it sweeps up that way. The other direction of wind is from the northeast, which brings effectively Siberian weather and cold weather into the UK. So anyone who's lived in the UK knows that when the wind blows from the northeast, it's absolutely freezing and it's horrible weather. When we get it from the southwest, we get a lot of rain, and it's relatively temperate climate during that. And so those are the two that we get. And what's important when we do the modeling is that we end up putting a lot of meteorological data in there. There's typically about 5 years worth of met data that's fed into that wind speed, wind direction. And we got wind rose data. That's just like a sort of compass rose. And it shows you which way the wind is mainly blowing. And it's mainly from the southwest, with some in the winter from the northeast. And when you then do, what you then look at is you look at the emissions from the chimney that's going to be there, the stack from the facility, whether it's an EFW or any other sort of plant, and you look at the way that the gases come out of that stack. They rise out of the stack because there's a great big huge fan that blows the pollutants out, and that gives you momentum. There's also heat that's there that gives you buoyancy. You don't want too much heat because obviously with a plant like this, we're trying to recover the heat. That's what's used for power generation, but there's still heat. And so you've got momentum and velocity to carrying the gases up. Then you've got the wind that blows it in the predominant direction. And as the plume, which is not necessarily visible at all, it can be invisible, it goes out, it spreads out, and it mixes, and you get dilution. And that's what we then look at to see how that goes. So I don't know how many of you are used to looking at barometric pressure graphs that you get with the weather. Typically here in the UK, we get the weatherman and he shows a series of graphs, and there's a lot of concentric lines. Well, you can do the same thing with pollutants, and this is called a pollution rose. And up on the screen there, you'll see on the left-hand side is the maximum annual averages that are predicted to be to potentially occur under a set of weather conditions. Now, it's always important to recognize when you look at these what's called isopleth plots, is that these aren't what will definitely happen. This is what will happen in the worst case scenario. That's why it's the maximum annual average level. And on the right hand screen, you see that it says maximum incremental 1 hour averages. So this is the levels that are due to the plant under a very set of special conditions. It's not the everyday condition. This is when the wind is blowing in one direction, that the temperatures are a certain way, and that is what could happen. So we see that the levels go, or the lighter line as far out is 5, then 10, then 15, and then 20. And this helps us to work out how to situate some sort of monitoring station, because when we do any monitoring, we need to see, can we see any impact? Well, we need to give ourselves as much chance as possible, because we're actually looking at really very low levels. Potentially the levels that come from an energy from waste plant aren't very significant. They're actually a very small proportion of what's there already in the background. So we look at these maps, and that helps us to determine the point of maximum potential impact. And that's where we in this case, we placed a monitoring station. And the other thing that we do when we're placing a monitoring station is we look to see who's around there. And ideally, what we want to do is we want to talk about something, we want to talk about a sensitive receptor. Now, a sensitive receptor could be a school or a hospital where there are people who are perhaps more sensitive to air pollution. So that's another criteria that we look for. So at New Haven, we chose a place on a road called Denton Road. We chose an enclosed area that had fencing and had electricity, because that's very important that we have utilities to run the monitoring equipment. We can't use generators or anything like that, because if we use a generator, it creates more pollution than we're looking for. So we have to have a good source of electricity. It has to be stable and be there for a while. And we also want to have a site where we can come back to, because we're looking here at the background. And what we want to do is to basically put a line in the sand and say, this is what it's like today. And then we want to look at what it's like in the future when the plant is built, but also when other things have changed as well. So air quality is quite fluidic in many ways. It's not stable. So, for instance, when we were looking at this, the government hadn't predicted that the amount of traffic would increase quite so exponentially as it has done in the UK. So, you know, things change with time. So, and when we're looking for data and trying to see what the impact is, we have to take that into account, even if the government forgot.
I suppose that's that's the point, really, is you're taking into consideration worst case scenarios. Not necessarily that would not always be what happens, but we make sure that we assess it on a really conservative approach. And I believe
Absolutely.
That's similarly to what's done in Australia. And actually, I might just throw to Scott just for a short moment. So Scott has obviously worked on our ARC project. And Scott, in terms of what Roger is explaining, is that very similar to what was undertaken for the ARC project, in terms of the types of modelling that we did?
Yeah, certainly. So we
for the EAS
a fairly prescriptive guidelines in Australia or in New South Wales. The New South Wales EPA set for us to follow our air quality impact assessment procedure, but it mirrors very closely to the process that Roger described in terms of incorporating local meteorology, local land use data sets, robust emissions data to run a dispersion model to predict impact from a source of pollution across the surrounding environment. So that was what was undertaken for the ARC project.
Okay, thanks. So look, Roger, just to go back now, the facility, this was all what we've spoken about is all, I suppose, pre-operation assessments. Let's start talking about what happened once the facility was in operation. I think it's been about 10 years that the facility's been operating now, give or take.
Something like that. That's right. We did two background studies. We did one back in, I think it was 2004, 2005. Then we did it again in 2011, which was about the year before the plant came online. That was to take into account things such as traffic increase, etc. And then we had another go in 2012 and 2013. Now that was within the first year of operation of the plant. So now we've talked about nitrogen dioxide. That's one of the bigger impacts, of one of the higher level of pollutants that tend to come from facilities. But we looked at a whole range of other pollutants as well. I mean, I don't want to sort of minimize. We looked at sulfur dioxide, we looked at carbon monoxide, we looked at trace organics, we looked at heavy metals. So we did everything. I mean, everything that is typically looked at and more are monitored when we do these background studies. But nitrogen dioxide is a really good one, because why look for something that's even, look for the thing that you think is going to be the biggest impact, and then see if you can see the effect. And that's exactly what we did in 2012, 2013. So in 2012, the mobile laboratory that was used for this study was resituated back in Denton Road, coupled up to the power again, and all the pollutants that we'd measured before, and some new ones. We also looked for even lower, smaller particles, PM 2.5s this time as well, because interest in that had come along. And we did some, that gives you, we measure there the air quality minute by minute almost. So you get lots and lots of data. But at the same time, we also started a year-long study using something called diffusion tubes. Now, these are very passive little tubes. They're about the size of a pen. Perhaps a little bit shorter, and they're about a centimetre or half an inch diameter across, and they're filled with little bits of chemical, and they act as chemical sponges, and they absorb pollutants such as nitrogen dioxide, and they're cheap, relatively cheap to deploy, not very, but they're still relatively cheap. And you deploy about 3 of them each site, but it allows us to put a whole load of them out. So if I remember right, we looked at 5 different sites and a control site that we believed was so remote that it wouldn't be affected by anything much. So that gives us a bit of a background as well, a bit of a check.
Is that what we're seeing here, Roger, on this, or is that something a little bit different?
No, that's exactly it. That's the results there. And if we look back at the ERM study that was carried out for Veolia back in the early days of 2003, 2004, 2005, and they carried out at Denton Road, which is where we situated the mobile laboratory. Another place that is very much in the same area, but little bit more in housing area, St Leonard's Road, the Hollow, and the Firle is the background site. That's the control site. And what we need to do is look at the data that we had. Sorry, I'm pointing at a screen, so it's none of you can see what I'm pointing at, but not to worry. If you look at Denton Road, though, look at the first data point, 23. We got 23, 22, then the following year, and then 27. Then there wasn't any more monitoring done until the plant was actually operating then. And so if you look right across where it says Veolia study at the far right-hand side, you'll see a figure 18. And remember that the maximum impact, right, on top of the pollution that was already there, was predicted to be 16. Okay, from those isopleth plots. So that's 16 on top of the background. Well, we can see that if anything, the actual air pollution had actually come down a bit in the whole area. And that's probably a reflection of motor vehicles having catalysts fitted to the cars, and diesel having things such as AdBlue added to them to reduce NOx emissions. If we look at
Roger, can I just get a clarity there, just because perhaps I'm not understanding something, and I just wonder if people listening might also be thinking the same. So are you saying we predicted it to be 16 and then it turned out to be 18, but did you say that's lower, or that seems higher?
No, well, okay. We predicted 16 on top of the background pollution. Okay. So in fact, we're looking at 23, or between 23 and 27 plus 16.
Okay, understand. So,
and in fact, we only saw 18, right? So this is a whole year of monitoring, not just a one point. It was done every 2 weeks. The monitoring was actually, these tubes were put out, and when all of that was averaged out across the whole period, and even individually every month, it was never very high. It was always very, very constant. And so we were looking at 18. So if there was an impact, a significant annual impact, we'd be looking at, well, for an hour average 16, and for the annual average, I think it was about 1. Okay. So we'd be looking at about 22 to 23 plus 1. Okay, well, we actually had 18. Does that
So
answer your question?
It does, yeah. So what you're saying is actually we took quite a conservative approach in the assessment, and that was still within the safe limit of operation. However, in actuality, it was much lower than that because we had taken such a conservative approach. Am I understanding?
That's
Yeah,
correct.
okay.
That's correct.
Okay,
And
no, thanks.
if we look at the hollow, for instance, again you see the same thing. So we take the samples, they're sent off to independent laboratories and analysed. They're not done by us, they're done by accredited laboratories. And again, we had the same sort of figure. It came down lower. So it shows that the background level of pollution in the area was improving, and in fact that the contribution from the EFW was negligible. I mean, it wasn't measurable. When we looked at we looked also, as I said, at data from an hourly average level as well. What we found there was that the pollution actually hour by hour had probably increased, but when you looked at it, it was always increasing when rush hour was happening. So there was always a rush hour effect. And so even with improvements in technology, it tended to go a little higher. But we weren't looking at 16 micrograms per meter cubed more than we had done when we'd looked before. So yes, there's an increase, but that definitely followed a trend of rush hour traffic, morning and evening. And there was one particular peak that we had, and it really was quite a high peak. So what did we do when we found a high peak? Well, first thing we do is we look to see which way the wind is blowing. Is it blowing from the plant? And we actually found that the wind wasn't blowing from the plant. It was blowing the opposite way. It was blowing from the northeast. So that high peak wasn't part of anything to do with the EFW. But not satisfied with that, we also go and look at other data from government sites which are in the area and see what happened with them. And what we found there was that the pollution level during that period had worsened in general. It wasn't just a local event. It was a general event across the south coast of Britain. And so the air pollution had actually worsened just for about a day. And that's what we find in the UK, and that's what you find everywhere. Occasionally you get pollution incidents, but it's nothing to do with the EFW. And so although occasionally you see a spike, you have to put it into context. It's no good saying. Sorry?
That's part of the role as when you're doing the monitoring as an independent expert, you look at all of those various elements. Okay.
Absolutely. You have to look at all available data, not just the data you get, because you want to put it into context. You want to make sure that it's valid and that you're fairly showing the what's going on. So the conclusion really was we didn't see any impact, to be quite honest. It was really like looking for a needle in a haystack.
And that monitoring at that site, obviously it's still operational. That's still
absolutely
going on today. Yeah. Okay.
Yep.
So I'm not expecting you to be an expert on Australian air quality, because I do acknowledge that you are an expert in the UK, but we have obviously different legislations here. And I'm not sure if you're aware, but the New South Wales government has actually implemented the most strictest rules and regulations around air quality monitoring than anywhere in the world, and noting how strict they are already in the EU, which of course are the rules that you're talking to and the regulations in which you adhere to in the UK. Do you think it's achievable to meet these strict standards? Or, what's your view on that, given that they're already so strict in the UK? Do you think it's achievable to meet them in
I think so, yes. I mean, as environmental standards improve, and they improve across the world as well, industry has to rise to meet that challenge. But the technologies that are involved with EFW are so mature now that we're actually having trouble. As I said just now with Newhaven, we were having trouble there monitoring and actually detecting any impact at all from the facility. So I don't see any major problem. The technology that we use for monitoring, that's another issue. It has to be capable of monitoring that. So as levels come down, it's important that it's usually the quality control of the data becomes even more important, because the equipment can do what's required. But there are points where, I mean, in the UK we have sulfur dioxide levels that are almost negligible now, and when you do monitoring, what you see is the detection level limit of the instrument. So, but I'm quite confident that what has been set in New South Wales is capable of being achieved. So yes.
Okay, no, thanks for that. And what happens to the older plants? Because we have had a lot of community discussion around retrofitting and whatnot, but what actually happens with the older facilities, and when rules change or when policy tightens?
Yeah, well, obviously these plants are quite big. It takes a while to implement things, and normally legislation gives you an implementation period to make modifications to the plant. But if we look at what's happened in the UK, in 1990 there was the plants were fairly sophisticated. They were the new style of plants that we had, but then over that period, things such as carbon injection has been added to the air pollution control equipment to reduce the levels of things like dioxins and mercury and whatever. And those have been retrofitted to some plants. Some the newer plants actually have them all incorporated. And when I say newer, the last 10 years or so, they were already designed, built in, and it's there. I guess as we look forward in the future, probably carbon capture is the next one in the pipeline. But generally speaking, people look at air pollution control equipment on these plants with the idea that some of it needs to be expanded up. You certainly don't mothball a plant. They cost a lot of money to build, and the air pollution control part is a significant proportion of what's spent on these plants. And so there has to be some sort of future proofing to them. And that's what normally happens. Legislators have to be, there's no point setting regulation that can't be met. Regulation has to be set, and then industry has to rise to meet that, and it has to be cost effective and practical.
It's interesting how you mentioned that, when in the UK, when you first started using these facilities, were obviously in the 90s, which is some 30 years ago now, and it's just interesting how we're only just getting these facilities here. It feels like we're playing catch up a little bit, but a good thing for us is that the technology has matured so much over that time, and we're getting the best of and the most modern technology that's available.
State of the art, I think.
So look, we are kind of coming to the end of the session, but I did just want to ask before we finish up, there are quite a few community members surrounding our proposal that have some concerns around air quality. As I just mentioned, it's new technology to Australia. We have a couple of facilities in construction in Perth, but we don't have any in operation in New South Wales. So I was just wondering, if there is anything you would potentially say to those community members who have those concerns, given your depth of experience. Is there anything that you would say to them?
Well, I've been involved with quite a lot of monitoring of plants over the years, and the thing is that the levels, the emission limits that are set on energy from waste facilities are some of the most stringent. In fact, they are the most stringent standards that have ever been set, because basically nearly all of the European directive monitoring standards are designed to measure very, very low levels from EFW plants, and that's what drives the standards forward. And I sit on various committees that look at, are the standards fit for purpose as the levels come lower and lower, because legislators set a number and then the scientists have to go away and work out, and engineers will have to go and work out how do you meet it. So I think, having looked at both what comes out of the stack, and then when we try to measure it, I can honestly say I've never actually seen much impact of anything really. We just can't detect it. It really is very, very low levels when it comes to looking at these species. So I don't think there should be concern really from that. I understand, of course, that there will be concern because it's change, and change is one of those things. But I think generally speaking, actually, the air quality may well be improved by the whole thing, actually.
Well, thank you so much, Roger, for your time. We really appreciate it. And I do hope people online found that session useful. Obviously, you know this stuff like the back of your hand, and we're just so appreciative of you making the time available to talk to us and to explain some of the methodology that was used in the UK. And we could look at how that compares to what we're proposing to do at Woodlawn, where our ARC facility would potentially be built if we were successful. So thank you very much for being here. Really appreciate it. For those people who are online, we will make this video available to you and to share with those family and friends that might have questions or who might be interested in watching. And if you haven't already done so, please have a look at the events that we have left to run as part of the EIS public exhibition phase. We would love to see you. Our independent experts that have worked on this particular project are available to engage with. So please come along, speak to them, and please also come and meet our project team where you can get all of your questions answered. And don't forget to make a submission to the Department of Planning and Environment by the 6th of December, which is the cutoff date. So please reach out to us if you have further questions. But for now, have a lovely evening and we will talk to you soon.